Let's talk more specifically about different types of neurotransmitters. There's a wide breadth of different types of neurotransmitters that are released from neurons. Amino acid neurotransmitters are things like GABA, glutamate, and aspartate. And those are just three examples of amino acid neurotransmitters. And what this means is that in this case, GABA, glutamate, and aspartate individually function as amino acids. We talked about proteins and the primary structure of proteins, which is the amino acid sequence. So glutamate and aspartate can be part of those amino acid sequences in producing proteins, but they can also function as neurotransmitters. So an amino acid neurotransmitter is exclusively the amino acid. That is to say, GABA by itself functions as a neurotransmitter. Glutamate by itself functions as a neurotransmitter. Aspartate by itself functions as a neurotransmitter. Now, it can be confusing, but we also have amine-based neurotransmitters. And these are neurotransmitters that are based off an amino acid, but it's not exclusively the amino acid. The amino acid is certainly the main building block of these neurotransmitters. Serotonin is one such amine-based neurotransmitter. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter based off of the amino acid tryptophan, but it is not exclusively tryptophan. There's other things added to that to make the neurotransmitter. So serotonin is based off of tryptophan, but it's not exclusively tryptophan. Another type of amine-based neurotransmitters are the catecholamines, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And they are based off the amino acid tyrosine. Once again, it's not exclusively tyrosine. There's other things attached or combined to tyrosine to make these neurotransmitters. But once again, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, which collectively are known as the catecholamines, are amine-based neurotransmitters. Purines like adenosine monophosphate and adenosine triphosphate can function and do function as neurotransmitters. We actually saw in the pancreatic beta cell where ATP functioned as a signaling molecule. It wasn't functioning as a neurotransmitter because it wasn't released by a neuron, but it was certainly functioning as a signaling molecule. So purines, ATP is a purine, adenosine monophosphate is a purine, and individually they can function as a neurotransmitter. That is to say, they will be released by neurons and activate a downstream cell. There are gases. Nitric oxide is released by neurons and functions as a neurotransmitter, and even carbon monoxide is released by neurons and acts as a neurotransmitter. Keep in mind, carbon monoxide at high concentrations in the body are very deadly because they outcompete oxygen for the heme groups and hemoglobin, but that's another story we'll talk about when we get to the cardiovascular system. Lipids can form neurotransmitters, or I should say, neurotransmitters can be formed by lipid-based molecules. There are two specialized classes of neurotransmitters, or how we classify neurotransmitters. The first one are the catecholamines, which I mentioned just previously. Acetylcholine is another specialized classification. It's a classification, but it is a specific neurotransmitter known as acetylcholine. So let's take a look at the catecholamines and acetylcholine. Okay, once again, I want to talk more about acetylcholine and epinephrine and norepinephrine. We talked about, or I mentioned, the catecholamines, which are dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. But here I'm going to focus on epinephrine and norepinephrine and acetylcholine. So we have what's known as cholinergic fibers. Cholinergic fibers are neurons that release acetylcholine. So this right here is a cholinergic fiber. It's releasing acetylcholine, which we abbreviate as ACH. To be clear, we refer to axons as fibers because as axons run through nerves, not to be confused with a neuron. A nerve is a collection of axons. It's like a fiber optic cable with a bunch of fibers running through it, and those fibers are axons. As a result, we tend to call axons fibers many times, or at least I do. So this is a cholinergic fiber because it releases acetylcholine. This neuron is a cholinergic fiber. Now we also have cholinergic receptors, and these are receptors that bind acetylcholine, or acetylcholine binds to these receptors. So here I'm showing the heart, and I'm showing acetylcholine binding to the heart. This depiction is pretty basic and not totally accurate. To be clear, acetylcholine is binding to the cells of the heart, specifically the heart muscle known as the myocardium. But this black receptor is a cholinergic receptor because acetylcholine is binding to it. Acetylcholine binding to cholinergic receptors on the heart are going to lower or diminish heart rate. These are actually what are known as muscarinic receptors. Muscarinic and nicotinic receptors is acetylcholine. And we can also see here, I'm showing the dendrites here. I'm not really showing a receptor, but I'm showing acetylcholine in blue, and that will bind to a cholinergic receptor. Any receptor that has acetylcholine bound to it is a cholinergic receptor. Now, in a similar fashion, we have adrenergic fibers. Adrenergic fibers release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and maybe to a lesser degree, epinephrine. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are very, very similar. I would say basically we refer to epinephrine as the hormone that travels through the blood, and norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that is released from a neuron and travels across a synaptic cleft to another neuron or even to another organ or cell of an organ. It's probably clear why cholinergic refers to acetylcholine, because that root word in acetylcholine is right here, cholinergic. But what's the relationship between adrenergic and epinephrine, or specifically norepinephrine? Well, here you go. In the United Kingdom, epinephrine is referred to as adrenaline. And the fiber that releases adrenaline is an adrenergic fiber. The fiber that releases norepinephrine is an adrenergic fiber. Any receptor that has norepinephrine binding to it is an adrenergic receptor. There are a number of different types of adrenergic receptors, alpha receptors and beta receptors, and we'll talk about those when we delve more deeply into receptors. Alpha and beta receptors, all adrenergic receptors are G protein linked receptors. Just put that in the back of your head and we'll talk about the specifics of that later. Whereas back to cholinergic receptors, nicotinic receptors are our classic ligand-gated ion channels, whereas muscarinic receptors are G protein linked receptors. If norepinephrine is binding to it, in this case on the heart, and once again the receptors not on the outside of the heart, it's directly on the heart cells or the myocardial cells. If norepinephrine binds to it, that receptor is an adrenergic receptor. And norepinephrine and epinephrine binding to adrenergic receptors of the heart is going to increase the heart rate and increase the force of ventricular contraction. Also, we see here epinephrine binding to receptor on a neuron. That receptor on the dendrite there would be an adrenergic receptor because norepinephrine is binding to it. Now, let's make this a little bit confusing. We've got 3 neurons in series right here. And if we focus on this neuron right here, specifically the axon, what type of neuron would you classify this as? Well, I've got it drawn in brown. Brown over here is norepinephrine, so that makes this an adrenergic fiber because it's releasing norepinephrine. We also see epinephrine binding to the dendrites here. So that means these dendrites must have adrenergic receptors. The adrenergic receptors are going to have norepinephrine binding to them. As a result, that means this neuron right here must be releasing norepinephrine, which it is. So this too is an adrenergic fiber. To be clear, the space between two neurons is the synaptic cleft. That's the space that neurons travel from one neuron to the next. So this is an adrenergic fiber because it releases norepinephrine. This is an adrenergic fiber because it releases norepinephrine. Now, back to this one, let's look at the dendrites. The dendrites here have acetylcholine binding to the dendrites. There's going to be receptors on the dendrites. Those receptors are going to be cholinergic receptors because acetylcholine only binds to cholinergic receptors. So if acetylcholine is binding to these dendrites, they must be binding to cholinergic receptors. And what I want you to understand here with this middle neuron, the fact that this is a adrenergic fiber or an adrenergic fiber because it's releasing norepinephrine tells us nothing about the receptors on the dendrites. That is to say, a neuron can have cholinergic receptors on its dendrites but release norepinephrine from its fiber. If we look at the most upstream neuron right here, this, I'm hoping you are guessing, is a cholinergic fiber because it's releasing acetylcholine. What type of receptors do we have here on the dendrites? I have no idea. Why do I not have any idea? Because I haven't shown any neurotransmitters bound to the receptors, so I have no way of telling you if these are cholinergic, adrenergic, or some other type of receptor. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about with regards to neurotransmitters, at least within this particular video, is termination of neurotransmitters. Our body, our cells do not want neurotransmitters continually activating or exciting or depressing. When I say depressing, things like GABA, which open up chloride channels, depress neurons. That is to say, they prevent them from being excited or depolarizing. Regardless of what the neurotransmitter does, we don't want it engaging the downstream cell in that activity constantly. We need some sort of off and on. So neurotransmitters need to be terminated. Oftentimes neurotransmitters, as they're released here, this is a cholinergic fiber because it's releasing acetylcholine. It crosses a synaptic cleft and binds to, in this case, cholinergic receptors, either nicotinic or muscarinic. Acetylcholine binds to these receptors, and at some point, they stop binding to the receptors. Some neurotransmitters just pop off the receptors because there's a limited amount of time that there's an affinity, that is to say an attraction between the neurotransmitter and the receptor. But oftentimes neurotransmitters have enzymes that break down the neurotransmitter and put them back in the neuron that released them. And that is what this enzyme does. This enzyme is known as acetylcholinesterase. It's also referred to as cholinesterase. But acetylcholinesterase breaks down acetylcholine and puts it back into the cholinergic fiber that released it. To be clear, acetylcholine is the combination of two molecules, choline and acetyl coenzyme A. During the enzymatic breakdown from acetylcholinesterase, it breaks down acetylcholine into choline and acetyl coenzyme A, and it takes that choline and moves it back into the neuron that released it. And the actual uptake back into the neuron is facilitated by sodium. It's a sodium co-transporter, specifically a symporter. So sodium is going to move down its gradient into the cell, bringing choline with it, because choline is going to be moving against its gradient. So the kinetic energy of sodium moving down its gradient is going to facilitate the reuptake of choline. Don't worry about the acetyl coenzyme A, but that is the reuptake of acetylcholine via acetylcholinesterase. A very popular example of reuptake has to do with medications known as SSRIs. SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now, to be clear, these are medications like Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, among others. And I think nowadays they may eliminate one of the S's and just call them SRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So serotonin, as we talked about, is a neurotransmitter that's released from neurons, and there will be a mechanism and an enzyme to reuptake the serotonin back into the neuron that released it. But these pharmaceuticals like Prozac, Paxil, and Zoloft actually inhibit the reuptake. They inhibit the reuptake to ensure that serotonin stays in the synaptic cleft longer, activating the receptors in the brain to function as a mood stabilizing pharmaceutical. So SSRIs prevent the reuptake of serotonin. So in our next video, we'll talk about receptors, G protein link receptors, and our basic ligand gated ion channel.